Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the channel. This is the first of our set of videos on doing true metal metallics, more aged, weathered, and used metals, than clean and shiny. We're going to do these work-throughs tutorials in two videos. First one today, we're going to work on putting down some foundation metals and getting some color into them in shade. Steel, brass, and copper. Then in the second video, we'll be focusing on weathering, rusting, scratch, grime, chipped paint, and so on. These videos, as I said, are focusing more on weathered metals. We will be using some terrain pieces to show the techniques. However, there's no reason that they can't be used for models as well. So for example, it's a Thanatar Siege Automata from Forge World, and his metals were all done using this multi-metallic foundation method. The chip paint as well, so we'll be showing you that over the next two videos. Right, let's get started. First things first, as I said, we're going to be using some terrain pieces to actually show this. Before we start on looking at the paint, I want to say a little something about looking at resources. For anything you're doing, resources are hugely important for observation at how things work in the real world, and then transferring that down to the miniature. So as we're focused on metals today, just Google image is your friend on this one. Bring up different images of rusted metals, weathered metals, aged metals. If we have a look at the metals here, this is rusted steel, weathered steel. So you can see there's a lot of different colors going in here. It's not just a steel color. If we look in, we can see browns, blues, greens. So it's to kind of appreciate all those different colors that go into metal as it ages and weathers and gets stained. Let's have a look at some others. Again, further aging, we start to see how rust occurs, why it occurs, where it occurs, and how it progresses. And then also how the outside of the metals, which are more open to being brushed and abrased, will still retain a little bit of brightness. Again, scratched and brushed steel, looking at the different colors we see some sepia tones in here, some nice nutty browns, there's some blues, also going in the steel. Looking at scratches, how light affects scratches. If we look at the right hand side of the picture, we can see that the light will cause the scratches to glint, whereas if we look over towards the left where the light is not, the scratches are still evident, but they are in shadow. So we achieve that by using a very simple glaze. If I look at this one here, again with scratches and all the different colors that are going into it. Moving on to chip paint and then rust. We'll cover this mostly in the second video, but just to give you an idea, again, looking at the different colors, rust is not just one color. Rust is a plethora of different colors. So we want to use a couple of different colors to show how rust grows and the different ages of the rust. Also with chip paint, it's never bright. It's always quite bleached out by the sun and then tinted by the surrounding rust. So we'll be looking at that more in the second video. Okay, first of all, what paints we got to use? We're going to start off with, believe it or not, little Martian Iron Earth. That'll be the first thing we're going to use. We're going to use some of the Dark Star metallics, the molten metallics. Start with black and bronze, little royal gold, and we've got two silver verde and pewter. Might kind of think, he's doing steel, why the hell is he using bloody bronze and gold? That is to add in a little more depth to the metal, a little more of the colors that are evident when you're looking at iron and steel. So we'll be using those metallics. For scratches later on, we'll go to a brighter steel. We'll be using some Model Air Chrome. That will be much later on. So those are our main paints. We're also going to do a whole pile of shades. So from GW, good old Nuln Oil, Agrax Earth Shade, of course, and then for stains and some extra color on the patina, Quelly Green Shade and Seraphim Sepia. We'll get to those later on. Okay, so as I said, we're going to focus on using terrain pieces. As I said again, you can use it on many minis. It's a Goliath I was doing before, which has already got his metal workups, and has been washed down. So we can use it on smaller minis, like with the Thanatar, or even smaller with the Goliath, or on nice big terrain pieces. We're going to start just with some of these terrain pieces from Necromunda. The reason I chose these is they're nice and big and they're easy to show off on screen. So the first thing I want to do is actually add some texture. If we have a look at it, it's very, very smooth. These are supposed to be underhive, janky and knackered and dilapidated and distressed. These are very, very smooth panels. So we want to kind of change that a little bit. Now you could easily just take a craft knife to it and start adding in scores and scratching, which is fine. There's another way we can do is, if I can find a brush. That's no good. That's what we're looking for. So we're going to add in some texture. We want to add in some texture to this. So we use the Martian Iron Earth. This is a kind of crackle paint. It's one of the GW technicals. So we just take a nice big blob of this stuff out, slap it down in the middle or anywhere we want to actually add some cracked texture. The cracked texture can then be used to kind of show as paint cracks off, or also as rust gets really bad, it starts to flake off as well. So we'll pop a few bits down, and we're going to work this in a bit more. If I leave it like that, when it dries, you will have a very rigid kind of line of where the crackle paint was put. We want to break that up, and that will show through the paint unless we break it up. So let's just pop a few bits down there. Right. And we're going to, just with a damp brush, feather out the borders, the boundaries of where we've put that paint down. This will ensure we don't have it, you can't see that it is just a blob of paint once we actually spray over. This is pre-primed. You need to prime it first. If you don't prime it first and you put the crackle paint down, a lot more of it will just flake off once it's dry. It's brilliant stuff, but it is not always the most robust once it dries. So we just want to smooth out these edges so there's less of a visible paint border once then the second coat of primer goes down. I just prime these with GW rattle can. If you're using an airbrush, exactly the same thing. Do prime it first and then put on your crackle paint. So we're going to fit some in here now into the corners. Again, just feathering out our texture paint. If you want bigger cracks and bigger chunks, add a bigger blob of paint in the middle. But again, do try and feather that out. Like so. Now, once that's totally dry, you can do as much or as little as you want. You don't want to get too carried away, especially when you're doing terrain pieces, you bat it all day. A few bits, it just goes a long way to break up this really, really smooth plastic texture. And once it's all dry, it looks something like that. Now, as I said, even with the primer, you do get some flaking. Even just me turning it over, there's a bit of flaking. So we can't paint on top of that. We need to seal that. Even though the few bits has flaked off, it doesn't matter. It'll just look as if bits of paint have flaked off in its weathering. So once we have that done, you need to seal that in again. So we give it a second coat of the old rattle can, and boom, it looks like that. Now you can still, if I turn to the side there, you can see you can still see where the paint went down. But once you start putting the metallics on top of that, those lines will disappear. If we hadn't feathered it, the lines would not disappear. But we now have some actual texture to our metallic slabs. So the next thing we want to do is actually start getting some base down. So after priming, texture paint, reprime, let it totally dry. We're going to start with the first of our colors. As I said, we're going to be using black and bronze. You're going to need a lot of dry brushes for this. I keep a load of them on hand. The GW dry brushes do fine. So this is Dark Star Black and Bronze. You could equally go for the normal Dark Star Bronze, which are much richer. As these are going to be a much older looking metal from the underhive, I want this more dull, darkened bronze. You could also use another type of bronze. If you're not using the Dark Stars, you can just as easily use something like Warp Block Bronze from Citadel. So we're going to start with black and bronze. We are not going to layer this on, because again, it's adding thick layers, which we don't want. We're going to overbrush. So we just very simply plop some down onto our towel. Nice big dry brush. Now for overbrushing is like dry brushing, but it's not as dry. Paint on the brush, wipe off the excess. Now the whole point is not to cover absolutely everything. Let some of that black bleed through from place to place, especially in recesses. You can let some of that do. So we're getting this on. Now you see, by covering that crackle paint with the second layer of primer, it's not going to flake off now. So again, paint on brush, wipe off any excess, trying to paint your hands, and get a good 95% coverage. But again, leaving some of that black bleed through, that's fine. It just adds to the shadow and the depth when we come to shading it later on. Simple as that. The other one. The edges I normally leave until the first lot is dry. So just easy as just over brushing to get this first coat. Need a little more paint. Don't gloop it on. Make sure you're getting a nice thin layer. The overbrushing, you will get a thinner layer than if you're actually layering it. If you layer it on, it's just going to be one tone the whole way through. That's why we overbrush, so we miss certain areas on purpose. So we have a look at that now. You can actually see we already have a little bit of shadow to it because I haven't gone into every single crack and recess. And you're as well leaving that. We're going for a very dark, weathered, neglected bulkhead. So that's the first layer, easy as pie. That nice brown color, and that's kind of forming, it shows a bit of the age of the metal, that it has this brown background color to it. So after that's done, we got one more, might as well use up the rest of the paint. Again, these small little blockades, just overbrush it. Overbrushing will give you a stronger finish, whereas if you dry brush, it's a lot lighter, and we want a nice strong finish at this point, but again, leaving some shadows intact. Now once that's done, we want to go to the second phase. Now second phase, we're going to go for some color. As we saw in those pictures, you get these kind of sepia colors and kind of, some yellows and stuff will form in the steel as it ages. We're going to use royal gold, again from Dark Star, one of their molten metals. If you're not using Dark Star, I would normally go with Gehenna's gold from Citadel. And yes, my Citadel paints are in dropper bottles. For a very simple reason, the Citadel pots are shit. I love the paints, but absolutely abhor the pots. So I decanted all of them into proper bottles. Right, so we're going with gold this time. This time we're going to go with stippling. Now you can sponge if you want to. Sponging will give you a lighter effect. I'm going to go with a nice heavy stipple. Right, so another dry brush out. Stippling, it's very simple. Tap off. Now, whereas we overbrush before with strokes like that, for stippling, we're dabbing it on. You can use a sponge, but the sponge will soak up a lot of the more of the paint, and it's a lot lighter when you put it down. We want some heavy. We want some nice heavy heavy show throughs on this one. It doesn't matter if the bronze is not totally dry, that's not a problem. So stipple on. You're covering less area each time. So the bronze, we got everything, leaving some shadows. The gold stipple. And again, you're like, aren't you doing steel? Why the hell are you shoving gold in there? Or is this posh gold? No, it's not. Eventually this will just show through as kind of tonal and color differences within the steel. Because as steel ages, it does take on different colors due to environmental effects, oxidization, staining, chemical staining, what have you. So stipple on. Again, all over the shop, just these nice strong stipple. Take a little of the paint off before you start. Don't just drop it into the paint and then go straight. You'll get blobs. We don't want blobs. And again, this is not putting on a thick layer, so we've no worry about losing detail. And you can see now we've left a lot of that bronze peek through, and that's exactly what I want, because it's giving us variation. It's giving us a nice color variation, tonal variation, and it's adding more character to the metal. Flip the bad boy over, a bit more gold. You can use a brass, any sort of yellow metallic really is what we're looking at. A little bit more. Now these are very shiny at the minute, because the dark star molten metals are, well, they're called molten metals for a reason, because it is like painting on liquid metal, and they are very shiny and very polished when they're finished, so we will come to dull those down. At the minute this does not look aged, it looks super shiny, but we'll come to that later on. So let's get this second part done. Again, going over everything. Even though these pipes are going to be done in copper and brass, it's still a good foundation for those later metallics. And don't leave some of the bronze, actually leave a lot of the bronze kind of peeking through. No rhyme, no reason, no patterning, just slap it on, give it the stab. And there we have it. That's our second stage. Easy as pesh. Now, once that's done, those need to totally dry. If you go to the next stage now and your first two metallics are not totally dry, it'll ruin it. So for our second stage, we're going to actually start making it look like steel. When it's all dry, it's like that. We've got our bronze showing through, we got our nice gold stipple, some heavy stipple and then some light stipple. Next thing we're going to do is a little bit of actual dry brushing this time. So it was over brushing, then stippling, now dry brushing. So for that we want a more steel looking color. I'm going to go with two here actually. I've got silver verde and I've got pewter. And as I said, the first two metallics must be totally dry before you get onto this. If they're not totally dry, these will start mixing in, and we don't want that. So give me a good old shake. Let's start with the silver verde. I'm going to use two. You don't have to use two. Again, if you're not using the dark stars, an alternative, you can use something like Iron Breaker from Citadel. It'll do the job just as nice. I wouldn't go with Lead Belcher because Lead Belcher is shit. Alright, so a little silver verde to start with. And dry brush. This is going to be dry brushing this time now. This is a nice silver with a slight green tint to it. Work it into the bristles really nice. You can see how shiny it is. The light catches it. And as the white, of course, overexposes my cameras. Right, so work that in nicely. I'm going to give this a good old overbrush, or sorry, dry brushing now. Again, there is crackle here. It's been now covered with primer and basically two coats of acrylic paint. That's not to mean it's, set in stone, so be careful when you go over your texture. And again, vary it. Let the gold peek through from time to time a little more than in other places. Don't start dry brushing and keep going until everything's up, totally the silver steel. You want to leave some of these colors poke through. We want to see a variety of kind of tones and hues coming through in this. Again, also look to where is going to be brighter and cleaner. In the recesses, it's obviously going to be a lot darker as grime builds up there. Out in the front, where people are maybe passing by and brushing it, of course, it's going to be cleaner as the dirt and the filth gets brushed off or knocked off. And vary your application. Just like that. Okay, so that's the silver verde. I'm going to change paints now, again just for variety. I'm going to use a little pewter. Pewter is a little brighter, which is a lot brighter. It's a colder metallic than the silver verde. The silver verde's got a nice warmth, kind of greeny warmth to it. So you can see this is more like, if you were to compare it, I suppose, something like Runefang steel. So I'm going to use a bit more of this again, just to build up variety and to make sure these metals are not going to be just a boring monotone. We want these to really look like actual metal does in the real world. I'm letting some of the gold breathe through, some of the bronze breathe through. In other places I'm hitting it hard with the pure pewter. Okay, I want to bring out some really bright spots, especially in the skulls, even though they will be coloured something else later on. Okay, you can see now how our chipped metals, the texturing is showing as well. It gives it a lot more depth, a lot more of a narrative to it. just like that. When you're happy with that, stop. And again, this must be left to totally dry before you move on to the next step. Again, if you start doing the next step before this is totally dry, you'll end up with a muddy, shocking mess. So let's put that to the side. That done, we are now going to move on to, that's what it's like when it's dry. Now it's super shiny. I can practically see my ugly mug in it. Right, it's super, super shiny. So we want to now dampen this down. I want to dull it down, get rid of that sheen. Old metals do not shine. They're dull. Usually because of oxidization and pollutants in the atmosphere. So we want to dull that down. And for that, we're going to use these two beauties. Null and Oil, it's basically a black wash, and Agrax Earthshade. You could, if you wanted to, use the Army Painter tones, but they're weaker. I want something quite strong. And we're going to mix these two together. Basically because as we tone this down, I want to give it a kind of a brown tint to the metal. So we're going to mix these two together. 2 parts Null and Oil, 1 part Agrax Earthshade, 1 part Lamy medium. Any simple medium will do. So we're going to mix those two together, and as if by feckin' magic, boom, there it is mixed. Gotta love a little bit of magic. So this is my mix. I use this mix a lot. It's always 2 parts Nuln, 1 part Agrax, and then some Lamy and medium. Don't thin it. I wouldn't thin down with water. Water does funny things to Null and Oil sometimes. Gives it a grittiness which I'm not always wanting. So a little bit of Lamy and medium acts kind of prophylactically to make sure that grittiness doesn't happen. And then you can use a little water to thin it further if you need it. So we're going to put some of this out onto the palette. Now, usually when you're putting on washes or shades, say not to go too heavy because you run the risk of coffee staining. If it pools, if you get pooling where you've put on too much wash, and as it dries back you get these concentric circles happening, and usually when you do wash, that's the devil's work. You do not want that to happen. However, with the metals we're not so concerned, because if we get any pooling and coffee staining, that will just act to show more patterning and age on the metals, so we're not going to be too concerned about that. We're going to put this on fairly heavily. Okay, so I just get stuck in with that. Again, you can see this is not a pure black. There's a brown tint to it, which was a little bit of the Agrax Earthshade. And I'm going to put a little extra water in here because this is really still quite strong. And slop it on like a Sunday breakfast. Get it into all the recesses and the grooves all over the place. Do not worry about pooling. If it pools, you can always suck that pooling back out with the brush, not with your mouth. But we want to let a little bit of pooling in which case. I want to keep this quite wet as well because I'm going to drop in some more colour as it dries. So give it a really good drowning. Once you've got the whole lot on, you can then kind of go back and go, right, there's a little bit too much there, there's a little bit too much there. And you can suck it out with the brush, no problem. There's a little bit too much in these little bits now, so we just take that back out of the brush. Make sure everywhere gets a good soaking. And as I say, if you get some pooling and it dries into coffee tide marks or coffee stain, doesn't matter. You just very simply smile and say, it meant that. Alright, so I want to let some of this pooling happen, especially down in recesses like this, where grime would collect and form. But not so much as it's obscure. Right, we'll let that. Now, while that is still, this is all still really, really wet. What I'm going to do is, I'm going to add a couple of more little bits of colour in here. A little bit of Seraphim Sepia. Don't bother washing your brush, no need. No need. A little bit, just a little Seraphim Sepia on the tip of the brush. We can add a little bit of colour in here. Now, why am I doing this while it's still wet? The reason is, if I do it while it's still wet, this Seraphim Sepia will diffuse into the other colours, and it won't look like you've just put it on. It's just a more natural way of doing it. Let's show a bit over here as well, and a bit there. Okay, I want to put another colour in. Let's go a little bit of Quellia Green Shade, our Lorden shader. It's a bluey green, it's fantastic. We'll be using a lot more of that when we come to the other metals like copper and brass. So we want to put a little bit up in the corners here. Just adding these little extra colours, like the pictures we saw at the start of the tutorial. you saw there was so many other colors go in. More Coelia. Okay. All the different colors you get as steel ages. These colors come from things like atmospheric pollutants, oxidation, just chemical spills, what have you. So let's just pop some in here. Don't go too mental. It's a bulkhead, not a bloody rainbow. But just adding these little extra bits of color, add to it. And again, we're going to let that totally dry before we move on to next stage. Once that's dry, it looks not like that, because that one hasn't been finished yet. Again, if you're letting the pools happen, it's not a problem at all. It will look better for it in the end. So we went from untreated to treated. So now it's really beginning to look janky and darkened. You can see where I let some pooling happen. We've got nice build up of grime happening. Some of the extra colors I put in. So next step, I want to add a little bit of brightness to it, a little bit of unshaded. So I'll just get myself another dry brush. I'm going to use a brighter steel this time. I'm just going to go a little of that iron breaker, actually, why not? The Citadel metallics are not as lustrous as the Dark Star, and I want something that's not quite as bright and shiny this time, so I'm going to use a little bit of that iron breaker. Just work it into the brush. And we're just going to hit the edges. Now, we'll be going over this, but I want some, not doing much, just brightening up a few little areas and getting these kind of like streaks. Before we move on. So that's the basic steel now done. You can leave it at that point and go, right, that's enough. Fine, I can put it on my table. Let's go play. Or we can move on and start actually bringing out a lot more of the different, I call accent metals. Accent metals, usually we can look at things like copper and brass. So we have a whole pile of little nice details here, which we can focus on. So let's take out a little copper to start with. We've got our normal copper color. It's a nice orangey copper, and then we've got a polished copper, which I'll use for a little bit of highlighting. So copper, and I want some brass as well. We're going to have some brass fixtures. So we'll go with the Dark Star brass. We'll start with the copper. We're going to do some copper pipes. I'm going to keep piping as copper, and then the fixtures I'll do as brass. So let's take a little of that copper, put that onto the palette. Adding in these accent metals, again, it just makes it look richer. So we're going to blank these in. Again, these are going to be really, really, really shiny at first, but we will dull them down. So we'll start with this nice copper pipe up here. At any point from now on, you can kind of basically say, right, that's enough. Those look good enough to stick on the tabletop. Or if you want to go a little further, bring them to life just a little bit more. You can continue on adding more elements, more techniques, more distressing, more weathering. With each successive level that you add to it, it'll just become that little bit more alive. So there's only one pipe on that for the copper, so we're going to do some brass now as well. We've got a couple of copper pipes up here. Adding these little bit of extra colour in. It takes from just being a natty piece of terrain to throw down on the table something a little bit cooler looking. Right, so that's our copper down. Now let's base in our brass. While that copper dries, remember our whole point here is to get something that not just looks good on the table, but looks feckin' excellent on the table. So I'm going to use some of the Dark Star brass. It's a very kind of bright brass, but it will be getting toned down and weathered later on. So we got some nice vents and grills down here. So let's going to break these up. And by using the brass, I open myself up to being able to do things like verdigris and a different type of patina, which steel doesn't actually get. Don't forget the top edges. I even hate the top edges because I always forget them. We've got some nice fixtures up here. We can do those in brass as well. As I said, this first video is really just our foundation work. We're laying the ground for all this kind of special effects and stuff we will be doing in the second video. The rust work, the paint chipping, the verdigris, and a few other little tricks and I'm liking this light over here. We will eventually have this light turned on, and we will do a knackered out light, but still one that's going to have a glow. So we're going to do a bit of a glow coming from this light. Again, that would be in the second video when we come to detailing. But I want to do the metal around that light just in brass. It'll make it stand out. And also when I come to doing the OSL, I can darken it down as it goes into silhouette. So we've added a couple of little extra metals. We've a ruined one here. On this one there's not really much extra to add. These embrasures I'll leave as steel. Now there's a lot of broken metal on that. We'll come to this later on because this is going to have a real shine on it as if it's been blown through and it's blown back to the actual raw steel. So we'll leave that one for now. So just wash out the brush. Now next thing I want to do is we want to tone this down. This is all our darkened steel and we got this ridiculously bright and shiny copper and brass. For copper and brass they blacken, so we're just going to use pure Nullen oil to darken these down. Actually I'm going to highlight that copper ever so slightly first, a little bit of polished copper. I do the highlight before I do the darkening because I want to kill that sheen off again. So on the copper, I'm going to run a little bit of that brighter copper along the top. Now to dull these down, we're going to go with the pure Nullen oil this time because brass, bronze, coppers, they blacken as they oxidize. So let's get some pure neat Nullen oil on the brush and slap it on. You can bring it down below the vent just to add a little more shadow. Again, not being shy with the wash. Normally when we put on like washes or shades or glazes, very shy with it, in fear of getting, as said, like the tide lines. With this, we want a very strong effect, and tide lines are not even a concern at the minute because they just will look like staining on the metal. We'll be doing the same up in these pipes here, be it brass or be it copper, they're both getting it nice and heavy. We'll come back to doing the light later on and I'll pick out the bulb and we'll do a little bit of very, very simple OSL coming out of that light. I want it to be a light that is old and crappy and basically on its last legs. It's not going to be a nice big bright shiny street lamp. So our OSL will only come out a little bit. And this one here. Again, when you're throwing on this wash, don't be shy. We can flow over a little bit just to give a drop shadow underneath that pipe. And as that dries, it will kill the sheen, but we're still with this nice blackened, tarnished copper pipe with brass fixtures. And we'll be adding more detail into that later on. Now, one last thing we can do before we finish. Take a little bit more of the old Agrax. I want to add some brown, more brown toning. This is a pure Agrax. I'm going to add some more brown tones into my metals. Put a bit of water into it, thin it down. And I'm going to add some more brown in towards the grime. You don't have to do this, it is just an extra step, but adding more, I want some more browny tones going in on these metals, especially around the rivets. It's partially in preparation for when we start doing rust later on. Spot it in, it's almost like wet stippling. Move it around a little bit. Especially hitting for these rivets. And anywhere that just looks a little bit too clean, we can just add this extra colour. You always get browns coming in on steel, especially as it starts to hit that point where the oxidization will eventually end up in rust. Okay, and we can leave it at that. So that's our foundation work done. At this point now, it's ready to go. You could very, very simply go, right, that's enough, thanks very much, put it on the table and play away. Next time, we are going to be going a little bit further. Taking this is our first foundation piece. We're going to bring this further. We're really going to add more kind of narrative to it, bring it alive, adding in things like rust, chip paint, grime, streaking, spillage, a whole pile of different techniques like that. We'll also add in some lights, a little bit of OSL going on, some scratching, some abuse, and the like from that. So that's where we are for today. The next video will be up in about a week's time, hopefully. If you like the video and if you have any questions, please feel free to message me over on Twitch or leave a comment down below. If you enjoy the video and you want to see more, please do hit subscribe and ring that bell. And until next time, happy metaling. Cheers very much.